Welcome, everyone. I'm going to wait just 1 minute and just see if we get a few more people in before we get started. Hope you all are having a wonderful RDAP and a lovely day wherever you are. Are the slides showing you all? Okay, good.
Yep, they're showing.
I have so many screens. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending session 5B, Supporting Qualitative Data Communities Past and Present at the RDAP Summit 2023. This is a Zoom webinar. Attendees are muted and your cameras are off. To ask a question, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. The session will run from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern with the last 15 minutes for Q&A. And this is a panel presentation, so we will technically save all the questions till the end of the session, but we also have an interactive component for you to share ideas, and I'll share that with you in a second. After the end of the session, feel free to continue the conversation in the chat in Whova. We're happy to, and we should probably create a discussion forum in Whova. I didn't even think to do that before, where we can talk about qualitative data. The Research Data Access and Preservation RDAP Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. This is a code of conduct. There is a code of conduct helper available during our sessions. Their name is Lindsay Guypen. You may direct messages to them in Whova if you need assistance. They can give you the code of conduct email address or the link to the incident report form if needed. So thank you everyone for coming to our session. I'm going to be actually a moderator for the panel, and I'm delighted today to facilitate this conversation about supporting qualitative data communities. The theme of our conference, of the larger conference, is building on experience, centering communities in data creation and access. And that theme provided a great opportunity to highlight support for qualitative data researchers. Before we begin, I want to give a starting definition for what we mean by qualitative data. Qualitative data are generally evidence that is text-based or than a numeric in representation. These data typically come from interviews, observations, documents, images, and more. While the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data is somewhat arbitrary, the goal of qualitative research is often distinct in that it looks to find insight into the ways of communicating the development of meaning, language, and social interactions. In our discussion today, it will become clear that communicating this area of expertise is a key concern and can sometimes be challenging. As such, often qualitative data support is not given the priority or given a priority despite patron needs. In 2016, Mandy, one of our panelists, talked about this issue in a chapter where she compared qualitative data support in libraries to the TV figure Jan Brady from the Brady Bunch, who was famous, if you're not aware of this TV show, she was famous for being the overlooked middle child and often loudly complained about that. I brought this group together today to see if that still holds true. And so that article's from 2016. So compared to Mandy's insights in 2016, the question is where we are now with supporting qualitative data communities, and have we advanced, or is it still the middle child? So a component of much of qualitative research is acknowledging our perspectives. So we'll each talk a little bit about who we are and why we're here, and I'll kick us off and then go into the panelists. For me, my current position is the head of research data services at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries in the Research Data and Digital Scholarship Unit. My original job was focused on social science quantitative social science data, but that role expanded over years in conjunction with the research interests and my own research interests and the research interests of our patrons. And that led to the creation in 2016, along with Mandy, of QuishDig, which was the qualitative social science and humanities interest group out of iAssist, another data professionals organization. We also had a special issue of iAssist's journal called IQ that was focused on qualitative research support and asked many of these same questions. The position I'm in now and my previous position had more focus on qualitative support, and currently I'm the only person in my unit who supports qualitative data analysis software. there is one other person in our libraries who has some experience, but doesn't, isn't at the same level. Doesn't think she's at this, she does not think she's at the same level, I guess. And so we're trying to skill up everyone when it comes to qualitative data analysis support. I get at least one question a week on qualitative data. And that's currently, there's currently a big effort in Philly to create a qualitative, a Philadelphia-wide qualitative research consortium. So I'm really excited about the future for qualitative research here at University of Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia. So we're going to move on to our panelists. We have three wonderful librarians who have provided support for services for qualitative data and who have done research on the state of the field often using qualitative methods. In addition, we are joined by one of our favorite people from the Qualitative Data Repository. And I invite each panelist to introduce themselves and talk about their work supporting qualitative data and qualitative research. So Mandy, if you want to start.
All right, great. And I think I am unmuted. Great. So yes, my name is Mandy Swigert-Hobaugh. I work at Georgia State University Library. We often call ourselves GSU for short. I am currently the head of Research Data Services Department as of about a year ago. My basic background with qualitative starts as far back as really the mid 1990s when I started my sociology graduate program. And I finished my PhD in sociology in 2004, which was qualitative focused. As far as supporting other qualitative researchers, I've been here at GSU doing that pretty much since 2013 to the present. And most of that support takes the form of helping them use the in vivo qualitative data analysis tool, but it does sometimes bleed into doing a little bit of qualitative method support in association with in vivo support, or sometimes just by itself, qualitative method support. As Linda said, I did the Jan Brady article or chapter, I should say, in the book back in 2016. I did an iAssist presentation at the conference on it as well. And as Linda already said, I co-founded with her the QuishDig interest group through iAssist. And then the special issue that Linda mentioned in 2019 in the iAssist Quarterly, or IQ, I had an article in there called Bringing Method to the Madness, an example of integrating social science qualitative research methods into in vivo data analysis software training. So that's me in a nutshell. So I will turn it over to the next person. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Hagman. I'm the Social Sciences Research Librarian at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I'm a liaison as well as kind of the qualitative person. I was hired with the expectation that I would continue my predecessors' practice of teaching the workshops on Atlas and in vivo, which were the two software that we have in our lab space. And since then, I've really had the opportunity to expand our services. Like Mandy, I've found that answering questions about software really you can't really do that without knowing about what someone is thinking in terms of methods and even things like epistemology. So I've been working on kind of expanding our workshops to talk more broadly about methods and ways of approaching analysis, kind of regardless of software. I've been teaching co-teaching a course, a doctoral course on using software for qualitative data analysis, which is just the best sort of like niche sort of thing to teach ever, super fun. And then so last year, I did some research with a graduate student here at the U of I on looking at websites for qualitative researchers, or library research data websites to see what we could find for qualitative researchers. I'm building on some previous work by, I know it by its citation Canaan, although there are several people involved in that. And so they found it similar to what they found. It was very difficult to find information about qualitative research. It's usually very focused on the software. And if you look at the language around data services, even if it's not like explicit about quantitative data, there's a lot of language that kind of points to that as kind of the default, things like focusing on statistics, focusing on reproducibility as kind of the sole measure of research quality. So I'm very interested in kind of how we can build services that are intentionally inclusive of different methodological approaches and research paradigms. And I imagine Hillary will talk more about similar work we did along those lines as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Bassell. I am the head of the Humanities and Social Sciences Librarians at Ohio State University. I'm relatively new to that role. I've been the head since I think September of last year, but I've been at OSU since 2016. I'm currently also the subject librarian for political science, communication, and international studies. I've had a few other social science departments that I was sort of responsible for in previous years. But in my role as the librarian for those departments, I support researchers, faculty, students who use a mix of different approaches, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. Prior to coming to Ohio State, Jessica and I actually worked together at Ohio University. That's how we know each other. And I think that, at least for me, kind of interest in looking at qualitative methods came out of a study that we worked on graduate students at Ohio University, where we did a kind of a mixed methods approach, and we had lots of interesting conversations along with our third co-researcher about the kind of the strengths and drawbacks of different approaches. So I think, at least for me, my interest in this was sort of born out of that. Academically, my background before I got my MLIS, I was in a PhD program for philosophy. Didn't finish it, but ended up getting a master's along the way. And so I would say I'm interested in questions around epistemology and sort of applied ethics, and it sort of comes out of that background. Jessica and I published a paper that came out last year in iAssist Quarterly, Going Qual In, like a good pun title, towards methodologically inclusive data work in academic libraries, where we interviewed a number of librarians working in data services and subject librarians about their conceptions of data literacy, what work they do to support qualitative researchers, and trying to kind of come up with a more inclusive understanding of data literacy, data services that would account for qualitative research.
Oh, sorry. Desi.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone, and thanks for attending our presentation today. I serve qualitative social scientists in from a different perspective or in a different capacity. I am the senior curation specialist at the Qualitative Data Repository, as Linda mentioned. I very much move in the same circles as all of the other actually panelists, including being a member of the Kushtik group at iAssist and all that. My personal background is also in social science, where I did primarily qualitative work. And that was before I joined the Qualitative Data Repository, which has been around for about 10 years as well. So similar time frame. As I'm listening, I was thinking about that similar time frame as the one of all of our other co-panelists. And I don't know if that says anything about the place of qualitative methods in the social sciences or not, but in any case, it's an interesting coincidence maybe. And in my current role, I work to facilitate or assist social scientists, but really broadly conceived public health scientists, education scientists, other the quote decade, I saw that briefly, other people from disciplines that in some way are cognates of the social sciences, who want to make their research more transparent in one form or another, and in particular who may want to share their data, but those are not necessarily exactly the same things, which is why I mentioned them as separate activities. So more broadly, my current interest, in addition to helping people kind of make their research or show really the rigor and richness and value of their qualitative work, which, as has been mentioned already, sometimes people that come from those perspectives feel on the defensive within their respective disciplinary communities, and I just don't want them to. In addition to, doing what I do at QDR, I think it's very important for people who do qualitative work to understand that work and those approaches and those methods are in no way deficient, so they don't have to constantly be defending themselves and explaining how they're as good, but just to be confident in what they do and show with that, the rigor and richness, as I said, of their work in the best possible way. In addition to that, through what we experience in our everyday work at QDR, I've also started focusing a lot, obviously, on the ethical component of data sharing in particular, and we do actually primary empirical work on that as well, surveying and interviewing both social scientists on the one hand, but also IRBs, which are involved in this whole process. So those are some of my other topics that I currently focus and publish on.
Great, thank you so much. Just to give you, we're going to go now into the panel discussion, and we have 3 big questions that we're going to talk about. I'll post a question, each panelist will respond, and then we'll have a little bit of time for open discussion with attendees potentially, and then proceed to the next question. And so before we go too far, though, I will share with you a collaborative document that we created that has our questions. We would love to hear from you. We are qualitative researchers, so we like to get feedback from other people and know kind of what you're working on. So if you want to participate, feel free to go into our collaborative document and describe, give your answers to the questions that we're going to be discussing today. So first question up is, where does qualitative data work happen in your library? What are the strengths or weaknesses of this approach? Has that changed over time? And if so, in what way? And we're going to start with Jessica.
I've only been here for coming up on 4 years. So I've seen kind of my role change. The qualitative data work is largely me. We do have kind of an infrastructure that supports doing that. We have a really great workshop series, and I've been able to get access to all sorts of software, which is good because we don't actually have all campus software access for a qualitative software, which is kind of mind-boggling at a place this size. But so it's a lot of a weakness, I think, is that there's not really consistency. People spend a lot of time negotiating access to software, and I answer a lot of questions individually. I work with people on setting up, we talk through their methodology and work through, what would you do with the software to kind of meet that methodology, which I love doing. I think it's just probably not the most efficient. So I'm, working on trying to build more of an infrastructure. We do have a qualitative research initiative through our Center for Social and Behavioral Sciences, which has enabled some more conversations, more connections. There does seem to be on campus a sense that there are qualitative researchers out there who are a little bit beleaguered and want to band together. I heard someone refer to the research initiative as the support group for qualitative researchers. So really trying to embed myself in that, but then also think about how do we build things that don't necessarily require people to talk to me or someone else, which obviously I would love for them to do, but it's not the most scalable sort of approach. So I think over time that's the direction I'm hoping to go, but I would love to hear how other people are managing this because I think it's really challenging.
Awesome. And Hillary?
Oh, thanks. So in terms of kind of the user-facing support side of things, I would say that the work happens in a couple different places. So our library is organized into several divisions, and we have a research and education division being the one that our subject librarians are in, as well as a separate department for research services who are based in our research commons space. And this includes our data services librarian, digital humanities, JS, data visualization, some other folks. So this group, the research services group, is kind of discipline agnostic. Researchers from any department can go to them and they focus on sort of functional areas of expertise. whereas the subject librarians are liaisons to specific disciplinary departments and programs. So I would say the work happens with the subject librarians. It also happens in research services to the extent that a subject librarians department works with data. The expectation is, and it is becoming more and more, I would say, that the librarian has at least some idea of the data sources and methods that they use. But I would say the fact of the matter is that this is the case just for more subject librarians than for others. So you have certain academic departments that get more robust data support, including in the area of qualitative research from their subject librarians, and others. Subject librarians do partner with our colleagues in research services to offer data support. And I do definitely want to give a shout out. We have a new data services librarian, Kelsey Badger, who I believe is at this conference, who has helped me kind of think through a lot of these questions as I've become the head of the Humanities and Social Science Librarians group. But there are a limited number of research services people, there are a limited number of subject librarians. So I would say that, and obviously Ohio State is a huge campus. I would say that we don't support data analysis in general in the library in a really systematic way, at least when it comes to the social sciences. I know that we have offered some R workshops in the past, and sometimes some other types of tool-based trainings in the library. But a lot of this that I'm aware of has really happened outside the library and other centers. So I don't think that we've really had workshops on qualitative analysis software, at least since I've been at the library. And I would say the question for any kind of tool-based training is it better to have a workshop in a discipline agnostic space like the Research Commons, or is it better to have the subject librarian doing it for their specific disciplines and people? I think there's strengths and weaknesses of each approach. The benefit of having kind of a discipline agnostic workshop is that it's open to everyone who needs it. But of course, there's a risk that it could be generic to the point where it's not really specifically helpful to what a person is doing in their discipline. And on the flip side, when subject librarians offer these workshops, if they're able to, they might leave, or if they have 5 departments that they're working with, they might just not have the capacity to do that type of tailor-made support for each department. They're also in terms of qualitative support at Ohio State, there are other units on campus that really do a lot with this, but they tend to kind of be focused on their people. So the Education College specifically has a qualitative research lab, but it's really just open to people in the College of Education. So I think that as we go forward, it would be really good for the library to expand more into support for qualitative research, especially for the departments that don't have as much support in this area. I know the departments I work with are predominantly quantitative and statistical in their approaches, but they do have qualitative researchers, but they're in the minority. So because of this, I'm trying to make more of an effort to offer more support in this area. So yeah, I will stop there.
Awesome. And finally, we have Mandy.
Okay, hi everybody. Okay, so I'm gonna say a lot of ditto to everything that was already said. I think like especially with Hillary, I think some of the structure and the strengths and weaknesses that you highlighted apply to Georgia State University. Within my research data services department, for years, I was pretty much the only person within our department that was doing any qualitative data support in that specific department. But now I do have a colleague that we hired more for quantitative, but she had mixed methods experience, so she was able to now also help out with some of the qualitative data work. I think that if I try to think of like not saying things that have already been said, potential strengths that I guess I see that I've been trying to do more of is, in addition to those more like generic or open anybody discipline agnostic workshops anybody can come to. I am increasingly doing more course-based instruction or sessions. So I even did one this morning. So my voice might be a little shot because I did a 2.5-hour session with an English class that in the English department, but it was what's it called? It was like research and methodologies or research methodologies for writing, kind of rhetoric and comp was their area. So these more course-based things where I can try to tailor the needs a bit more to what their discipline, what they might be interested in, what types of specific data types they're interested in. So whether it's, video recordings versus like interviews or focus groups. So it's a strength to be able to do a little bit more of those tailored sessions to maybe better align with the attendees' needs, but it also becomes I guess a weakness or a burden in some ways if you try to do too much customization all the time for every single class. And when you're only one person, so that definitely, with everything, there's pros and cons. But then, otherwise, I think I'd say that most of what everybody else said, it kind of holds true for us as well. If I had to say how things have changed over time, the fact that there is another person that I can call upon to maybe be a little more of a help in the support has been great. And yeah, I think I will turn it to whomever's next.
Desi, did you want to weigh in on this one? Or
No,
Okay.
I, as you can understand, I come from a very different perspective.
Yeah.
So I can't fit the answer. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's a couple of questions we had in the chat. One was asking about the mix of services, which I think is a really interesting question. And Jessica and I put some thoughts in there. So the others want to put thoughts on that question, but we can come back to that after we go through the rest. So the next question number 2, how do you describe qualitative data services to qualitative researchers in a way that is inclusive of the wide variety of data types, methods, research paradigms that might be used? And then what are the challenges that you've run into? And I think we're going to start with Hillary on this one. Yeah, Hillary.
So I think just to start with, it's important to be clear about who and what you're talking about when you're talking about research data services. I think that we in the profession, certainly at my library, when we talk about the services and support that we provide for researchers working with data, we mean to be inclusive. We mean qualitative as well as quantitative. We're not consciously excluding qualitative researchers usually, but when we talk about data services, often I think it kind of, when we don't distinguish between types of data, we kind of end up defaulting to quantitative data in the tools we support and sort of the descriptive language we use when we're describing what people are doing with data. This could be because just there are more quantitative researchers, at least the departments that I work with. I don't know, there could be lots of reasons for this, but I think the first question just to think about is like, are you actually really providing services for researchers that are working with qualitative data? And if so, I think you should be explicit about it. So this means thinking through like different types of data that a researcher might be creating or reusing or looking for, depending on the point in the research life cycle that they're coming to you. And, it means making sure you have the resources and conceptual sort of grasp of qualitative research to actually help them. So I don't think that like the needs of different types of researchers in the social sciences at least are like radically categorically different in a lot of respects when it comes to managing data, but I do think on our campus at least, the majority of method centers and data support services have quantitative approaches, statistical approaches in mind. And this includes a library. So to the point where I think that qualitative researchers, when they hear data services, might not think that you're talking about them. So being explicit that you're talking about qualitative research as well, backing this up with support for specific types of data analysis, qualitative data analysis tools, if you get into support for tools, and knowing and using kind of the vocabulary and conceptual like framework that are relevant to qualitative research. So for example, like if you're talking about data transparency or the importance of making your data and your methods available for others to see, be inclusive in how you're talking about the need for this. So not every researcher is going to be sharing their data so that others can replicate their experiments, right? Be aware of the fact that this idea that you should be making all of your data available for others to see might come through with some, ethical issues around privacy when it comes to qualitative data. And then, maybe their obligation to protect their subjects might take precedence over the obligation to make everything open and transparent. And then there's also the fact that for qualitative researchers, analytic transparency is really important too. So just putting all of your data out there doesn't tell this whole story. You need to show how you're making like interpretive choices in your analysis. So I think all of these things are kind of packed into talking about support for qualitative researchers. So when we're describing our data services, we should be inclusive. When we talk about data sharing, not just saying data for replication, but talking about data sharing for research transparency that includes analytic transparency. And just being knowledgeable of what this looks like for someone who is working in a qualitative context. So I will pass it over to the next person.
That's a great point. Mandy is your next one.
Oh, I'm up. Okay. So
Sorry.
no, that's okay. Let's see. So I think the way I'll approach answering this question about inclusivity is to focus for a moment on data types and thinking about the challenges that the fact that there's such a wide variety of what type of data people might be analyzing using qualitative methods can pose for thinking about training again, since a lot of what I do is training on in vivo. Like even this morning, it's nice that I had this morning, that it's fresh in my mind. I did this, this course-based instruction for an English research methods in writing class. And so I started it off with, well, what's the kind of data that y'all might be wanting to analyze? And, some was interviews, and then somebody maybe, well, I'm going to do surveys, like open-ended questions and surveys. And then you might have people, well, I'm going to do a visual analysis of images, or I'm going to do video. So it can be anything could possibly come up in that setting. And you think of, okay, I have at at best, maybe I had 2 hours today, which sounds like a lot, but it still wasn't enough to get through, maybe touch on every type of data. And then when I tend to do my more like open to anybody workshops, I tend to be focused on all text-based resources, because that seems to be the thing that people want the most. But I'm increasingly like trying to deal with the challenge of how can I expand to do more trainings that might be more data type specific. Like we're only going to look at surveys in this 1.5-hour workshop, open-ended questions of surveys, or in this workshop it's going to be all about visual image analysis. So expanding those trainings to maybe be very data type specific is something I'm thinking about trying to do more of. And then sometimes just data process. I don't know if this fits research paradigms and or methods, but I recently finally, after helping people a lot one-on-one, put together a workshop on how to work with other researchers, team coding in a workshop, because, you know, I'm increasingly, I think a lot of the qualitative researchers aren't necessarily working in isolation and by themselves and just doing their own project. They're working with other team members. And so they want to know about, how do I do team coding to do like inter-rater or inter-coder consensus or reliability type things. And I kept helping people more one-on-one. And then I finally like kind of pooled all the resources and was like, I'm finally going to do a workshop on team coding. So I think that's kind of my thoughts in terms of inclusivity, is just, you know, the amount of different types of data, the different methods, different processes, trying to wrangle all that in when it is so diverse is challenging, but is what makes supporting qualitative research really interesting too, because there is so much diversity. So, and I will pass it to the next person.
We have Desi's up next.
Yes, I mean, that's a huge issue for us, because again, being a data repository where our go and our place in, you know, talking to researchers comes at the end usually of their projects, when for one reason or another they have been directed towards data sharing, because that's still the Modo experience. It's not people thinking about it proactively from the beginning, although luckily more and more of these scenarios are happening. But for the most part, the people that we work with come to us because they've been kind of told that they have to share some or all of their data, or that's what they think anyway. And so to address them in a way that makes them feel understood as qualitative researchers, and to make it clear to them that we all, the whole staff of QGR, is completely attuned to the sensitivities, in particular the ethical concerns that sometimes accompany the sharing of that type of data, is a very important first step. Otherwise, we completely, you know, lose that person as a, you know, as a potential depositor. So we really very intentionally generally talk about research materials. So I don't even usually use the word data to begin with when I'm talking to someone, even though obviously it's in our repository's name. But I talk about let's talk about, you know, I try to assess what are the types of materials that you collected during the course of your work. You know, can you put them in buckets for me, like metaphorical buckets, so that you can describe to me and I can, you know, get a sense of your work. Because as I said, people come to us with this feeling that, you know, what they do maybe doesn't constitute data, or what they've collected doesn't constitute data, and trying to clarify to them that it is empirical data, and just because it comes in these very diverse, rich, different forms doesn't mean that we can't still think of it as data. But the vocabulary that is used is quite important in creating that sense of inclusivity. And as I said, because I think a lot of the people that I talk to tend to be defensive about the, you know, it have to be, I guess, in their disciplines, in their departments. They feel that they're methodologically speaking a minority, and that's, you know, that's always a not a safe feeling, you know, even in this professional kind of disciplinary sense. So we try to remove that discomfort talking about the materials that they create in this different way. But then the biggest challenge, and in terms of, so this is regarding data types, then in terms of what methods people use and what research paradigms, we have to be completely ecumenical about it, because we don't have any particular criterion on that. Like for us, any data that constitute qualitative data of the various types that the other panelists mentioned are potentially appropriate for sharing in terms of format. And then we assess, you know, in terms of content and in terms of ethical concerns and so on, what could be done and in what form they could be best presented. But there is nothing that in terms of methodology or how exactly they were created that a priori would exclude a qualitative or multi-method project from being published by QDR. Then the challenges that we run into are, you know, multiple, but one that I would like to highlight, again, I think maybe a little bit different from how the data librarians that you all are that talk to researchers, the challenges that you experience. One that we experience is, as I mentioned, people thinking about the data sharing component very late in their project, and not, you know, this not being part of this being data sharing, not being part of the culture of social science work, and especially qualitative social science work. So training people or educating them maybe for the next time, because often people would come to us and we'll do the assessment that we do and talk to them about the materials that they've collected or created, and under what conditions, for example, if human participants were involved, under what conditions they collected these materials. And we would make the assessment that we either cannot publish the data sometimes in any form, or that some very abstracted, kind of highly aggregated version of them can only be published from this project. But then we try to make that into a training into an educational experience, and kind of telling people what they could have done differently at earlier steps in the research project. Yes, especially exactly as Mandy just wrote, that particularly making sure that they're informed consent forms, starting with that. I mean, it's not the only step, but it's a critical step early in the process. So trying to make it into an educational experience, even though in the particular case or the particular project that they came to us with, we may not truly be able to publish the data or publish most of the data. So to try to, embed in their process going forward some of those steps that would facilitate potential data sharing. So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we deal with. Hopefully one that with time and enough, sending that consistent message, both from our perspective, but again, obviously that they're local librarians and research resource people that they've worked with, sending the same consistent message that you need to think about the potential data sharing from the early steps in planning a project. Hopefully that challenge would disappear, I hope, maybe in 10 years when we talk again. So that's one that I wanted to highlight. Again, it's not that, we can talk about the specific challenges that are inherent in sharing qualitative data, but that's, I think, something that all of us can relate to, and maybe we'll address it in the discussion if people want to. But beyond that, how some of that ethical challenge can be resolved if things are planned for properly in advance, if you have discussed the data sharing component with your participants, if you have embedded in the informed consent, if you have, for example, not collected as much identifiable data as you have because you truly didn't need to, if you thought about it earlier on, and things like that. So that's the one that I'll highlight.
Awesome, thank you. That's great stuff. And there's also a chat going on in the Q&A. So if you haven't looked over at the Q&A, those of you in attendance, you might not see those under the answered questions. And Jessica, you want to weigh in on this one?
Just ditto to everything everyone said, of course. And I would add that for me, it's about challenging the idea that there is a singular qualitative research, that there is a singular research, just asking people to say, when you say qualitative, what do you mean? The big Q, small q qualitative frame has been really useful, and I can put a citation in for that because I realize it's not necessarily a thing that everyone has read, but like the more interpretive versus, thinking like you could treat qualitative data in a very kind of positivistic, quantitative way. Atlas TI yesterday came out with their AI coding tool. Lots of feels about that. It's really just quantifying qualitative data. So yeah, just challenging that in discussion individually, and also kind of as much as we can in kind of public places. But there's lots of ways to do research. There's lots of ways to build new knowledge. There is no single, you don't have to do interarray reliability if that doesn't meet with your, that's not what your research paradigm says. Although I guess if you have, a community member who wants to see that, then maybe that's a different thing. So lots of conversations around how are we defining these terms that just get used quite a bit through research and are actually really complex multi-definition terms.
Yeah, we should have a whole session probably on the AI and quantitative research question. Oh boy, that was fascinating when that came out. So next one, and we're pushing on our time here, but this is a really important one that I know a lot of people are interested in, is how does data management support for qualitative work address the unique ethical concerns, especially with data related to marginalized communities? And considering these issues, how do we best support qualitative researchers with the NIH mandate? And I'm throwing this one in here if the panelists don't know about this second question, because I have gotten so many questions about qualitative work from our School of Medicine. And so I know that a lot of people when they think of like schools of medicine and the NIH, they go straight to quantitative, but there's a lot of qualitative work being supported by the NIH. So it's a really important thing to be talking about as well. So we'll start with Desi on this.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second part about the NIH mandate, because we also have been inundated with well, in a good way, people starting to think about this early in the process of their research, which is exactly what we've been wanting. So that's great. But then also people being very worried about it if they do squarely qualitative work, and they have been in the past supported by the NIH and are not used to, again, thinking about the sharing component. And before I say kind of what we tell them and how we try to support them, one other thing I would say is that we internally did a little bit of kind of an investigation on over the years before this year, over the past 10 years or so, the kinds of projects that the NIH has supported. A huge portion of them have a big qualitative component embedded, and none of those data are available in any form anywhere, because again, people didn't think that that's the part that they need to do anything about, even in previous cases. So clearly, even again, people who have been supported by the NIH and are kind of used to thinking about their materials in one way or another have to change their thinking under the kind of impetus of the new mandate that covers all types of data. So what we do is, again, we would, sorry, let me just see exactly how you phrased it. What do we do best to support qualitative research with the NIH mandate? From the point of view of the NIH mandate, I think the thing to say to people is that it doesn't matter what data you're collecting. If they're primary empirical data, there's value in them. And that's the reason why the NIH wants you to think about the longevity of those data and the accessibility of those data for others after the end of your project. So that's kind of the message that we start with, and that it is the same for everybody. Now, it is more, the ways to get there, the ways to get to actually making those data available and accessible after the end of the project will differ depending on the collection method. And then that's where we enter with the big piece on ethical concerns. So thinking about, is it that something in your project, your research project inherently puts your potential participants at risk? Or is there truly a different component where the data sharing piece would increase that risk? And that answer is not, the answer to the last question is not always yes. I mean, maybe just the people's research is risky, and doing some version of data sharing after the end of the project doesn't further enhance the risk. It's just risky. I mean, that what they're doing, the kinds of questions maybe they're asking, or the kinds of situations that they're observing. There's a lot of observation, observation that the NIH supports, apparently, from what we discovered. So maybe there's just something risky in the research that's separate and different completely from the data sharing component. And those two things don't need to be conflated. So that's one, to kind of think about those pieces, to ask people to think about those pieces a little bit more critically, and not just throw the broad concern, okay, I'm just concerned about my participants, which is understandable and legitimate, but let's try to break that risk down and see whether the data sharing component truly has an additional risk factor or not. And then if the answer still is yes, then let's think about, what is it about it? Is it that you will put your participants at legal risk or reputational risk? Again, we really try to drill down the kinds of things that people are concerned about. And depending on what the answer is, then we can try to work out a solution. Is it that there's going to be an access control condition on the shared data, which of course, will minimize the ultimate number of people who could make use of those data down the line, but would protect the participants? Is it that the de-identification needs to be more thorough? Is it that only an abstracted version of the coded qualitative materials would be shared, but not the full transcripts, which is, again, under the NIH mandate, a completely valid and acceptable form of sharing? So it's just kind of working one by one through these, this kind of, not really a decision tree, but through this list of questions that each subsequent step and choice regarding eventual data sharing is informed by the answer of the previous question. So that's what we try to do with people. And the challenge then that everybody else talked about, kind of when you were discussing software support and maybe method support. The challenge then is doing this in close collaboration and individual discussion with people, but at the same time having to address so many people, drawing up some kind of broader lessons that people can kind of maybe follow on their own a little bit, so that even if we still talk to each one of them individually, which we so far capable of doing, but barely, even if we talk to each one of them individually, they've answered a lot of those questions up front, so that our conversation maybe doesn't have to be an hour and a half each time, because that's not sustainable and we can't really do it in the long run. So that's, to the degree that I can quickly summarize it, that's kind of how we approach it. Just trying to distinguish, like I said, just general concern about the safety or confidentiality of people's information, the human participants' information, disaggregating into the smaller bits of concern, so that we can address and do something about it, as opposed to just saying, oh, it's so risky and it's so concerning.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, no, that's great. And Jessica was the next person for this one. Did you...
Just really briefly, because I don't do a ton with actual data management. We have a data management department, which is really great. I think occasionally this does come up in conversations about analysis and kind of what to do with the data. And I think our university has a new kind of community engaged research push, I guess. And they're trying to build relationships with, Indigenous tribes and nations who have been pushed out of Illinois. And so there is kind of a broader conversation about research is not a neutral thing, and all this research is done with people and shouldn't just be done on them. So I think in those conversations, kind of reminding people that like IRB is not the sole kind of ethical framework for deciding, that these bigger things going on, and hopefully you can discuss with participants, the community members, like what they want to see from the data, whether they want, before, I know that's kind of the pie in the sky kind of thing, but to start kind of injecting those into the conversation and stop positioning IRB as kind of the sole arbiter of kind of what's ethical use and sharing of data.
Great points. And Mandy.
Every time I hear my name, I'm like, oh no, it's my turn. So I'm trying to think. My department at this point, we don't do a whole lot of data management support in general. Our library doesn't do a whole lot of data management support in general. So there's not probably a whole lot to say here. And when I mean like data management from more like the curation end product standpoint, I think the marginalized communities things is definitely something I think that should be at our forefront, because our university, I think, is officially considered a minority serving institution in MSI. So a lot of our qualitative researchers are working with marginalized communities. So I think, to the point that what Jessica already mentioned about kind of those broader ethical concerns that are tied with that. Let's see, I'm looking at the second question, because how do we best support qualitative researchers with the NIH mandate? I mean, I think like all the things that Desi has said is probably like critical of thinking, getting them to think from the beginning about the sharing, then the anonymization, get it out of my mouth. One thing that I find fascinating to talk with people about, just in that aspect about how do you truly anonymize your data, is I was one of the members of the very first, the North Carolina State University, NCSU's Data Visualization Institute, I think is what it was called at the time, and where we did an exercise on anonymizing an excerpt of an interview, and it dawned on me that with that exercise, that it's a lot more than just giving somebody a pseudonym. It's so much more that what somebody says, the content of what they say in an interview may reveal things about themselves, may reveal things about people they interact with. So I think and then when you're particularly dealing with health related data and other potential vulnerable populations, there's a whole host of lots of other things that could crop up. So I think I'll end my spiel there and turn it to the next person.
Awesome. And Hillary, thank you.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I also don't do a ton with data management, but what I would just kind of highlight in my thinking around this is just thinking about what it is that we owe our participants, what we as researchers owe, thinking of ourselves as researchers as well as the researchers we work with. What do they owe the communities that their participants are part of? I think, you know, as a librarian, open is this really important kind of overriding value, but knowing that it's not necessarily the overriding value in every discussion of ethics, and just being cognizant of the other ethical values at play. And I'll just give a shout out to this qualitative researcher, Jennifer Esposito, and Kelly Limes Taylor Henderson, who have an article that I've thought was really interesting in guiding my thinking around this, called "Using Others in the Nicest Way Possible on Colonial and Academic Practices and an Ethic of Humility." So I'll put the link to that article in the doc.
Thanks. And we've been throwing a lot of these links and things over into the collaborative document. So if you are interested in going back and seeing these, feel free to go over there. Are there any other points for any of these that you're interested in going back to? We only have a few minutes, but I'm going to open it up to either our panelists or to any more questions from the participants or attendees. If you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A. And I will say, I think just when it comes to the NIH question, one of the interesting things about this is, you know, all of the sample templates that were created really were created, not very few of them were created with qualitative research in mind. And so that was one of the questions we ran into, was whether or not, we had several people ask us, do you have a template that's more similar to what I do, you know, because there wasn't the same kind of proliferation of qualitative templates like they were the other kinds of templates. And it's been a lot harder to have that discussion sometimes. Any other questions, or maybe we have one more in our.
Actually, just one related comment to the last question about kind of data management and sharing of qualitative data, that you know, my big challenge of being a person who's trying to do instruction on using software stuff is finding qualitative data out there to use, you know, so like that's the big thing, is like, where can I find a bunch of interviews, you know, to be able to use for my data for my my teaching, and that's been always the biggest challenge, because I'm like, do I have to create everything all myself, like, to find that? So as a potential, I don't know if it's a good argument to convince other, you know, researchers, please put your data out there. I would gladly cite you in my teaching to be like, I got this data from you, and yeah, so.
Yeah, I think the sample project from In Vivo, the Down East project, has probably been used to death for a lot of people who teach from it. I know,
yeah,
I've taught it so much, I'm starting to get kind of a little bit sick of it. But that might be a great place. QDR might be a place where we.
Well, we have projects that we've highlighted that are particularly suitable for teaching, and we do have multiple now people every semester approaching us to get a sense of what we offer so that they can pick something. So that's by far one of the best documented secondary uses that we know about so far, because we don't really, for open, you know, we have closed projects for which we know exactly who's using them, but then the vast majority of our projects are not controlled access. And so for those, we don't track who's using them for what. Maybe people are using some of those for pedagogy, and we don't know. But the ones that we do, sorry, not for pedagogy, for secondary analysis, and we don't know. But the ones that do approach us to ask, how do we organize this so that it becomes a project our students, for example, can analyze in vivo, whatever we know about, and it's by far one of the most common reasons why people come to us for secondary use. Yeah.
Mhm.
So if you are looking for appropriate materials, reach out and I can suggest some projects as well.
Let's Wait, somebody's got to get opening. Oh, that's me. I'm sorry. I clicked on a link and started talking. Sorry about that, Desi. All right. Well, thank you so much for everybody, for our panelists. This was fantastic to talk through these questions and think about where we are with qualitative data. I will say, I think compared to where we were in the past, like we are in a better place in terms of awareness, and especially having QDR as an established repository that more and more people are able to tap into. I think that's a fantastic change. All right, I think that is our time. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees for coming. We have a break until 4:10, which I think then is our game night. So feel free to come back and play some games if you are interested. Have a great day.